Buenas tardes. En primer lugar, antes de todo, quisiera dar la bienvenida al profesor Michael Cox, viejo amigo de la Fundación Ramón Areces, y al profesor Peter Trubowitz, al que saludamos con todo afecto y todo cariño. Quisiera dar la bienvenida a la Fundación también a Adam Osterfield, encargado de todos los temas relacionados con la London School of Economics en España, entre otros, y gran amigo y colaborador de esta fundación, así como a su colega John Woodger. Retomamos la colaboración con la London School of Economics tras el confinamiento, que obligatoriamente disminuyó mucho nuestras actividades. Estamos buscando y hemos encontrado nuevos escenarios en función de los confinamientos y de las restricciones habidas por la pandemia, y hemos tenido, desgraciadamente, que suspender las masterclasses que daban una seña de identidad muy relevante a nuestra colaboración y que por razones obvias no pueden tener lugar. Nos hemos concentrado en las conversaciones online sobre temas estructurales y temas de actualidad. Quiero también informarles que tanto la London School of Economics como la Fundación Ramón Areces van a continuar su colaboración en el año 2021 y más allá, mediante la realización de conversaciones online como la que hoy nos ocupa y que tendrán lugar a lo largo del año que viene. Tenemos como Fundación la oportunidad de beneficiarnos del alto conocimiento y especialización de los más prestigiosos profesores de la London School of Economics, que nos ilustrarán sobre los grandes temas y vectores de la economía mundial. Es especialmente interesante y de enorme actualidad la conversación de hoy, que va a versar sobre los distintos escenarios que influyen en las elecciones presidenciales norteamericanas: economía, política exterior, impacto económico del COVID-19, malestar social interno, etc. Escenarios que de alguna u otra forma marcan tendencia en todo el mundo. La actualidad de las intervenciones de los profesores Cox y Trubowitz se ve relanzada por el hecho de que dentro de 5 días tendrán lugar dichas elecciones presidenciales. Si hay una elección en el mundo que a todos nos afecta, es la estadounidense. Muchas gracias y me complace dar la palabra a mi amigo y colega Adam Osterfield.
Bueno, muchísimas gracias, don Raimundo. Muchísimas gracias a todo el equipo aquí a la Fundación. Bienvenidos a todos. Welcome to everyone. My name is Adam Osterfield. I'm the president of the alumni here in Spain and also a visiting associate at LSE Ideas. I'm delighted to host this first virtual event between the LSE and the Fundación Ramón Areces. In the previous 8 years, I would like to mention that the Fundación has supported a series of LSE masterclasses in social science here in Madrid, a series of 4 3-day seminars led by LSE faculty, which has to date seen 700 top Spanish participants be part of a high-level discussion on such issues as climate change, inequality, the future of Europe, technology, higher education, international relations, and many more. We are enormously grateful to the Foundation for its terrific support over the years, and I would personally like to thank the director, Raimundo Pérez Hernández, and all of his team on behalf of the London School of Economics, and for his collaboration on this and future seminars between our institutions. So today's subject, we'll look at scenarios for the United States of America, look at elections, economics, and whether the decline of global power as for the US is a real and tangible a process or thing. And I'm delighted to be joined from the LSE by 2 leading global authorities in the United States of America. Firstly, Peter Trubowitz, who is the director of the US Center at the LSE, which he joined from the University of Texas at Austin, and he has also held visiting professorships at Harvard, at Princeton, the University of California at San Diego, University of Chile, and many more, including in Mexico and China. We are also joined by Professor Michael Cox, who is the founder and for 15 years the director of LSE Ideas International Relations think tank at LSE, which was recently ranked the #1 university-affiliated think tank in the world, and which I'm delighted to be a part of. Professor Cox created and led the LSE's Executive Masters in Diplomacy and Strategy at LSE, and he recently finished a new introduction to John Maynard Keynes' seminal book on the economic consequences of the peace, something we might also take reference from in the current crisis. He is also currently writing a book a history of the London School of Economics. So, to start with, just to welcome you both, thank you very much for joining us here from Madrid to London. But let's start with your views before we consider where the US may be going, where we see the US at the moment. And if I could start with you, Peter, my question would be how you see the state of the nation at the moment, after 4 years of an extraordinarily different presidential administration. And have many of the very visible social and other divisions been simply exposed by Trump, the Trump administration, or have they indeed been driven by it? If we could start with you and your thoughts on that question.
Sure, Adam. It's a great question. Let me just first say it's great to be with you and Mick on this platform, and I want to thank the Fundación for the kind invitation really to participate in this discussion and this collaborative effort with the LSE. So, you know, in less than 2 weeks, localities across the United States are going to begin tallying up election ballots, and estimates indicate that we're going to see a record voter turnout with as many as 150 million Americans casting votes. And there is, I think, a sense in the United States that this election is different, no matter where you are on the political spectrum, that the country is at an inflection point. And I share this view. All elections are important, but I personally think this is the most important presidential election in my lifetime, and I've been around for a while. I think a lot is at stake for America domestically. And because of its outsized role in the world, I think for the West as a whole. Your question, Adam, is really an important one because it asks us to consider whether Donald Trump should be considered a cause of America's woes or a symptom. And the short answer, I think, the honest answer here is that he's both. He's both a cause and a symptom of the divisions, the resentments, and the dysfunction that are on display, most notably over the pandemic, race, and inequality. I mean, the country was already badly divided along partisan lines before Trump, ran for the presidency, announced his bid for the presidency back in 2015. But I think on his watch as president, those divisions have just simply become deeper and more intractable. And one might have hoped that the pandemic would have led Trump to see an opportunity to secure his power and his legacy by finding common ground in fighting it. But Trump, I think, pretty much responded true to form by using the crisis actually to fuel division and mistrust. And we can drill down later about why he would have gone in that direction. I think the question here is, whether this will lead to his undoing politically, we're going to find out, in what is it, 11 days at this point. If the polls are to be believed, a majority of Americans have concluded that enough is enough, that the country cannot afford another 4 years of Trump's approach to governance. And I think if Biden does win, most Western capitals, including Madrid, will breathe a huge sigh of relief. And I understand, and I frankly share that sentiment. But it is important to remember that Trump is also a symptom of something deeper that is going on in the United States. And that means that we should not assume that if he loses, America will suddenly be, whole again, that the damage that Trump has inflicted will suddenly be repaired. It won't. This is because Donald Trump has fueled that while he has fueled polarization, through xenophobia, through racism, through denialism, which was on display in part last night in the in the second debate between Trump and Biden. That is denialism of science. He's also very much, I think, a creature of the ecosystem in an ecosystem in the United States, where economic grievance and racial resentment and anti-globalism feed off of one another. Trump wasn't the first American politician to recognize or even, frankly, exploit these latent divisions and pressures, but he, I think, really was the first to do so openly and in a fairly systematic way for electoral gain. So even if he loses, I think those grievances, resentments, and attitudes are going to continue. And Trump's followers are not going to disavow him. And Trump wannabes, political wannabes, people that would want to carry the mantle, will quickly find a way to fill the political space in hopes of securing the Republican presidential nomination in 2024. Whether it's a Mike Pompeo or a Tom Cotton, and that doesn't mean that, I'm not saying that I think a Biden presidency is DOA, dead on arrival, but these political sentiments that Trump has exploited, manipulated, they're going to endure, and they're going to be they would be a constant source of political pressure that Biden would have to navigate, both in the area of domestic and foreign policy, I think.
Can I follow up on that, Peter? And again, thank you very much to the Fundación for invitation. Wonderful to see my old friend Ramón there, and great to be back. And I want to be back in Spain as soon as possible, because every time I've been down to Madrid and many other great cities of Spain, how much I've enjoyed myself. So this is a virtual meeting, but I just want to follow up on what Peter has said. And we don't agree on everything, but we certainly agree on this. And I think waiting for Biden and waiting for an answer to all our prayers or all of our desires that get rid of Trump and everything will go away. I think this is a fundamentally problematic position, because as Peter has written, and I've thought about this for many years, the United States is a very divided or polarized country. I remember reading a book some time ago, Peter, I don't know if you read it, by a British journalist called Martin Esler. It was written in about 2002. It's called The Divided States of America. Divided States of America. That was 20 years ago. Right. And I can remember the Clinton years very well. How divided was America during the 8 Clinton years? He nearly got impeached. How divided was America in the G.W. Bush years? Extraordinarily so. Not just over the Iraq War. How divided was America when they had their first African-American president after 2008, the financial. So there's something more fundamental going on here, Peter. And I think both you and I would say, yeah, of course there are many things that Trump has done to exploit those divisions, to make those divisions worse, and to do it in his own inimitable and imicable style. Nobody can talk like Trump. We know that. And by the way, we shouldn't underestimate his ability to exploit and also to mobilize. He shouldn't have won in 2016, we were told, and he did. Right. So, never underestimate Trump. I've always said that. So don't put all your money on a Biden victory either. I think we've got to be very, very careful. But going back to that more fundamental point that you've raised, it seems to me that what Trump managed to do so brilliantly well, and his campaign was a brilliant campaign, even if you didn't like the result, was to exploit every division that there was and to play on every division that was in America anyway. Divisions about class, which we're not supposed to talk about. Divisions about race. Divisions about identity. Divisions about how to read American history, which is going on even more so today. Divisions about religion and God, and how much of God. Divisions about gay marriage, about sexuality. Divisions about inequalities, which have grown enormously in the United States. divisions too about how America relates to the larger global economy, whether it's a good thing or a bad thing. And he exploited all those divisions and won in the Electoral College, not by a majority. And I think, again, just picking up on Peter's point, just to repeat it really, but to add maybe something more to it, because I know Peter's writing a great book at the moment on this whole issue of polarization. I would suggest, and again, I'm drawing from Peter's work as much as my own, is that what happened, I think the Cold War held America together, not just in terms of defining its foreign policy, but it held it together at home. There were divisions then, but actually remove that external pressure, remove that external threat, however you want to put it, it then allows these kind of deeper divisions to come out. And those divisions get greater in the age of what we would call hyper-globalization, where America's position in the world is both increased and extended, but at the same time exposed to outside pressures, particularly ones coming from, low-wage economies. And Trump was absolutely brilliant at exploiting that in 2016. And that constituency which he has, which is very secure, that base of his sticks around, doesn't it, Peter, at about 40, 41, nobody's deviating from that. That's what he's building on. He knows it's good. And that 41 or 42% isn't going to go away when we get to the next presidential in 2 or 3 weeks' time. I don't know if you agree with that, Peter.
No, I think we're on the same page here. So I do very much. I think, Adam, back to you.
Thank you.
Back to you, Adam.
Very good point. I think it's very, very salient point, looking at historical perspective as well, from both of you in terms of the cracks within American society in particular. 2 points really. One, I think certainly, Michael, you're right in that without an other, the US has looked much more inwardly, and without a sort of clear Cold War structure, of course, in a multipolar world and a rise of China in a similar time, that's meant a lot more perhaps introspection, but also confusion for America, both domestically and in foreign policy. Let me ask you both, just quickly, since we're on this subject matter about sort of division, an obvious one really about COVID and handling of the pandemic in the US. When incredibly large and strategic issues can come down to whether you wear a mask or not, which seems extraordinary to many of us in Europe, of course, but also around the world, in Asia as well. Is there something that sort of division, or the way in which it's been approached by the candidates, has been another element of division that may sway voters or may have an outcome of the election? It seems to be a substantial issue, of course. So just a couple of comments on that before we move on.
I'd make one quick comment, and I'd be interested to hear Peter's views on this too. Nowhere can I remember over the last 6-8 months living here in Britain, the issue of wearing a mask has not been politicized. I mean, there's been a question is it the best thing to do? How often should you wear it? And if you go down where I live locally here in southwest London, some people are almost wearing it like a kind of an item of fashion, almost. It's almost become like that. But it's not become politicized. We may criticize our government for some of the things it's done or not done throughout this whole crisis here in the UK. But nobody's made the mask political. And it's an extraordinary situation where wearing of the mask becomes a symbol of something. That's the first thing I'd make. And I'm really interested to hear Peter's, Professor Trubowitz's comments on that. The other thing is a question of science. We are supposed to be led by the science, and we've heard this phrase so frequently. And it's a problematic phrase because the science can actually be different. There can be different scientific answers to the same question, let's be honest. But nonetheless, we haven't seen a denunciation of the key scientists around the British government, nor I don't know what's happening in Spain or other European countries. Whereas in the United States, we've seen this, a critique of Fauci, and a critique of many of the scientists around. So again, how you explain that, I'm not sure. And I'll be interested to hear Peter's take on both those points and many more. But the fact is that it's become very politicized, both around the question of science and the question of wearing masks. And I'd be interested to hear what Peter has to say about that.
Yeah, I think that it's a very interesting issue. And I think, Mick has very nicely framed it. I mean, the mask has become, it has been framed in partisan terms by Trump. Biden has done everything he can to undo that frame. And I think what Trump did is really, in a sense, it's the 2 points that Mick mentioned. He fused them. What he did was he turned the mask into an argument against science and a kind of anti-elitist position. And the mask has become in the United States for a lot of Trump supporters a symbol of political correctness. And Trump very effectively made that move, it seems to me, back in, it happened back in April and May. And it's remarkable because you don't really see this elsewhere in the West. It's like a kind of non-issue, but I think it's because there were already so many doubts in the United States on the kind of right end of the spectrum, not only about the establishment, but about science in particular. And it plays itself out over climate change. And we're seeing it, the pandemic is like another instantiation of it. And it's a remarkable development. In some ways, though, from the standpoint of Trump as a political entrepreneur, it is not surprising at all. So the way that Trump operates is the minute he sees something that could potentially stick to him, like the pandemic as a political albatross, he tries to change the conversation and to deflect it. And, like I said, kind of at the outset here, another politician might have said, look, I didn't bring the pandemic to our shores, but it's here. And what we need to do is kind of work together, mobilize the science, get on top of this thing, and put an end to it, and really use it as a way to bring the country together. And Trump really went the opposite direction. First of all, before the thing with the mask, the first move that they made, and really it's not just Trump, it's the committee, the group that his son-in-law Jared Kushner led, tried to devolve responsibility to the states. And why? So that the states and the governors took the blame for what was happening. And and so I think that what we have seen is a constant effort by Trump to somehow displace responsibility and accountability, for the fear that this was going to end up being a referendum on him. And guess what? That's what's going on. This right now is a referendum on Donald Trump's, the election, on his management of the pandemic. And Mick is right. We don't know what the outcome is going to be. It's still, I know he's up, Biden's up by 10% in most of the national polls. But if that drops down to about 5%, it's possible that Donald Trump pulls another kind of inside straight in the Electoral College, just because of the nature of population growth in the United States, where it's occurred and so forth. So I think, it is really it's tragic what's happened. But, that the kind of the turning and the kind of conversion of the mask into a political partisan symbol in the United States. And frankly, if Donald Trump loses, it's not going to go away immediately. Biden said in the second debate that was held last night that he was going to put in a national mandate for the mask. Well, he might very well do that, but it doesn't mean that everybody in the United States will follow it, because it is such a politically loaded and charged issue right now.
Thank you. Thank you both very much indeed. That's an extraordinary issue there. Perhaps we can sort of follow on from the discussion we've had there so far about the reputation of the United States, which waxes and wanes, through many different administrations and periods of global history. but in general has often been seen as one of the most stable, powerful, both economically and militarily, nations in the world, and with a huge amount of innovation, a very robust economy, and so on. So what does the rest of the world, looking from the outside, Professor Cox, perhaps I could start with you. What's your point of view on how others see the United States, especially in the last 4 years, but again, coming back to some of the fundamentals that you both mentioned before about the state of the United States and how they are seen, whether it's a multi-state like Europe or whether it's individual countries like China and elsewhere, Latin America and so on. So just your points of view on that.
Well, as I would always say to my students, don't believe me, but do believe Pew Research. And Pew Research is one of these wonderful American institutions which does wonderful work on polling. And he brought out a new report, which, by coincidence, I happened to be reading about 20 minutes before we came on air. It brought out a poll of September 15th, so we're really quite up to date on this. And it basically shows an almost uniform decline in perceptions of America in a positive direction. In other words, America's image within the world has precipitously declined. Now, over what time period, we could ask that question as well. But certainly under Trump, there's no doubt that in many countries, but not all, and we're going to come on to this one again, so we qualify what we're saying. In many countries, particularly those close allies of the United States within the European Union and within NATO, there's no doubt that Trump came in with a bad image. Let's be perfectly honest. After Obama left in 2016, Obama was very, very popular in Europe, by the way, in most parts of Europe. Not everywhere in the world. Again, we've got to be careful. We don't want to over-Europeanize this debate. Obama left with high marks and Trump came in with bad marks, and those marks have not got any better since. Moreover, what has added to the negative view of the United States under Trump is, of course, been the handling of the COVID crisis. When you have a country which has got 4% of the world's population, with 20% of its deaths, then people start saying, well, maybe the United States system isn't working very well. So this moves away just from the question of what do you think of Donald Trump to what do you think of the United States and its governance or its health system or the way that it's run. So I think this is, if you like, segued from a debate about Trump to a debate about the United States of America. And overall, the last 4 years have not been good for its image, or what Joe Nye, the great Harvard professor, called its soft power. I think the really interesting question is to look at the outliers on this debate, though, because we don't want to say all democracies, because after all, there's a lot of non-democracies in the world today, or there's some democracies in the world who quite like Trump. Israel seems to like Trump quite a lot, and we can understand why. If you go to Brazil, and I no doubt if you followed and talked to the president down there, I'm sure he likes Trump. Erdogan, I think. In other words, other populist, semi-authoritarian leaders or countries like Israel, which is obviously a democracy, they would have more positive views on Trump. And although Mr. Putin has not declared from Russia who he wants to win or not win, I think one could think that in Russia, they may not be entirely hostile to a Trump victory, if I can put it in the English understated mode, Peter. The really interesting one, and again, I'd be interested to hear what Peter says, how China's viewing this. Because after all, China's been so central to the Trump narrative on foreign policy over the last 4 years, and we can say more about that later on. How, I wonder, is the Chinese leadership viewing a Trump victory or a Trump defeat? In some ways, Trump has been, in part, a real problem for China. Let's not forget it. On the trade deals and all sorts of other things. On the other hand, domestically, and we had a session about this yesterday, Peter, looking at the debate going on inside, there are many in the Chinese leadership, more nationalists than anybody else, obviously, to say, well, Trump has been quite good for us, reinforcing domestic legitimacy, support for China. And by the way, one final point I want to make on this, on the COVID, linking the two things together. I use the kind of obvious sporting analogy that COVID has been a game of two halves for China. It started extraordinarily badly, let's be perfectly honest, and we will still need to have a proper international, I think, look at how that happened. But China, using all the means of an authoritarian, semi-totalitarian state, seems, as we can gather from outside, to have come out of this, if not completely, not entirely, but all the indications are that China has done and come out of this COVID crisis very well or better than the United States. And again, that I think also is impacting on how people are looking at the United States, making that comparison. It isn't that they want to become members of the Chinese Communist Party or set up communist parties in their own country, but that image, I think, is also something we need to bring into the debate.
Thank you. Perhaps, Peter, would you like to comment on this too?
Yeah, Mick makes a lot of interesting points here, and maybe I will end by coming back to the China point, because it is it's a great question. Who would China prefer, Trump or Biden? And I don't think the answer is actually obvious, as Mick is suggesting. He's not suggesting it's obvious. He's saying that it's complex. But just to back up and maybe to amplify and echo some of the things that Mick has said, and also, you know, I would be interested in hearing how he views kind of the longer term implications for the United States in terms of its relative position in the world. I mean, I start from the same position that Mick does, that there's no doubt that the US brand has suffered a lot of damage internationally on Trump's watch as president. I mean, right now, America does not look like that shining city on a hill or a beacon of hope that, you know, Ronald Reagan used to wax about. His harsh immigration policies, which are very much in the news as of today because of the, you know, all of those children that have been separated from their parents and they can't find the parents. There are hundreds of kids in border facilities right now, to Donald Trump's embrace of white supremacist groups, to his support for odious regimes around the world, has cast the United States in a pretty negative light internationally. Mick is right, not across the board, because in some of those odious regimes, he's quite popular. But, you know, certainly, you know, kind of in most OECD countries, you know, Trump's stock America's brand has gone down and is tarnished. And this, as Mick points out, is very evident in those Pew polls. It's also evident in international media stories about the United States. But I think it's important here also to remember that this is not the first time that America's brand has been tarnished, or that the United States has behaved in ways that harmed its own strategic interests. And Mick has written about this, and he may want to chime in on it. I mean, one thinks of how badly the US played its hand over Vietnam in the 1960s, and the damage that it did to itself and its reputation, and then again over Iraq in the 2000s. Those were colossal strategic blunders that took a real toll on the country's international reputation. But I think in both cases, the United States found a way to revive and renew itself. And I think it's too soon to completely count the United States out. I think under new leadership, the United States has a chance of reviving its international fortunes. And, you know, it reminds me, you know, of Adam Smith's famous line about great powers. You know, Smith wrote in a letter to a friend, after the battles, Mick knows this, after the battles of Saratoga in 1777, so during the American Revolutionary War, that there's a great deal of ruin in a nation, by which he meant it takes an awful lot of bungling by political leaders to bring down a powerful and prosperous state. So I think kind of at one, perhaps the real question is whether Smith's theory will hold up if Donald Trump is reelected, to a second term as president. And I just want to end with, because I think, this question about where does China come down on this? I think this is a tough, who knows? And we're entirely in the realm of speculation here. But my sense is that they would not be that upset with a second Trump term. And I say that because they know, I think they probably suspect that if they get Biden is going to have to invest, to the extent that he invests political capital in foreign policy. He's going to be investing it in East Asia and with a principal focus on China. And we can talk about why that would be the case. And while it is true that Trump has been very tough, if you will, strong on China when it comes to trade policy, and, Mick knows this as well as I do, there are a lot of Chinese insiders who believe that under Trump, what's going on is the United States is retreating strategically from that region. And this is a concern in Japan. It's a concern in South Korea. And so the feeling, I think, is that, Trump is good to his word. It's kind of America first, partly, which means kind of not a fortress America exactly, but pulling back strategically. And so the thinking might be that, that he opens the space even more, and that gives China more running room in the hood, if you will, in the neighborhood, than they might expect from a Biden.
Thank you. Professor Cox, you want to comment on that as
well?
well?
No, I mean, I think Peter's last point is really well taken, and I think the focus on China is actually important, simply because it's been such an obsession for President Trump, and if he has a foreign policy, I mean, and I think he does actually, it's not one you may like. Because you don't like something doesn't mean to say it doesn't exist. It's been very much focused in on China, and it's easy to read it off through the corporations and say, well, the big corporations don't like Trump on China because they don't like trade wars. They're going to lose the biggest emerging market in the world in the 21st century. But it's not going to be just down to corporations who can define US foreign policy. I think that's an old myth. They have an impact, I don't doubt that, but it's a myth to say they drive it. And within China, and I'm picking this up, Peter, from people who know much more about China than I do, mainly Chinese friends of mine, who say, well, actually, China too has changed. Right. In a sense, we talk about Trump for America, but they talk about President Xi for China. And in some ways, the Xi strategy is almost, I wouldn't say Trumpian, but it's China first.
Right.
The China dream, making China strong again. And although Trump represents a challenge, particularly on the trade issues, China, I think, still sees some great opportunities in an America which is pulling back, though not becoming isolationist. It sees advantage in the ambiguity of Trump on alliances, particularly in East Asia, Peter has suggested. Moreover, the way the United States has handled, or Trump has handled, or whoever has handled the pandemic, only has reinforced positive images amongst a lot of Chinese students about China itself. Again, it's a very interesting area to discuss. We can only speculate, as Peter has said, but the indications are at the moment that if Trump is to be elected, I'm not sure China is going to see this as a major strategic or indeed ideological defeat.
Thank you both. So I'd like to continue with the theme of the sort of international perspectives and the globalization links that the US had. So discussing a little bit of political economy as you did, as China is obviously one of the the great economic superpowers of the world now, and the links with the US are crucial. But other trading blocs or other trading nations that the US has great and important ties with. I'm thinking in Latin America, with Mexico, with Brazil, with Europe, with the UK as well. Perhaps we can have a few moments on US-UK relations, since we're considering other ruptures coming up quite soon in that part of the world. But as someone once said, it's the economy, stupid. Is it still the economy? Is it the political economy of the US that's going to help turn America around, or is it going to be some domestic consumption that may bring it out of its difficult position at the moment, COVID, in a COVID context? So what kind of international relations, international political economy might we see the US pursuing in the future, having discussed China already, other parts of the world, with Europe, with Latin America?
Peter, I think that's over to you, I think.
Peter.
Yeah, okay, very good. Let me kind of step back. I think, Adam, it's an interesting question, and kind of segue into it by saying that I think probably the single most important thing to bear in mind here, actually, and in some ways it's obvious, but it's easy to forget, that whoever wins, Trump, Biden, the next president of the United States is going to be focusing the lion's share of his time on domestic policy, at least to the extent that, events, like that they permit. But I think this is already true of Trump, whatever you want to say about his performance on the domestic front, and it will be true of Biden. The reasons for this don't really require a lot of elaboration. We're in the middle of a pandemic. It looks like in the US case that, the next possibly, more lethal wave will be cresting right after Election Day. To say nothing of the economic devastation that it's leaving behind and the racial tensions that are roiling the country right now. And then there is the issue, this is kind of going back to an earlier point, but that Trump got traction on in 2016, which is anti-globalism. That issue has not gone away. If anything, I would argue that it enjoys more support in the United States. And so what this does is it places limits on how much political capital the next president can invest in foreign policy. And what that means, I think, is that he's going to need to set some strategic priorities. And that means that some countries are going to get short shrift. I'm talking to you, and so is Mick from the UK. I would put the UK on that list. And others will be prioritized. And it's a sure bet, as we have already suggested, that China will be in the latter category, but as much for domestic reasons as geopolitical ones. And so let me just say a word about this to, get the point fully on the table here. Because I think even though we've had an interesting discussion about China, we have kind of haven't fully framed this. And I think it affects not only what an American president does with respect to China, I think it also influences how they will respond and what they can do with respect to Europe. So one thing that I think Donald Trump understood better than other US politicians is that China could be made the poster child of globalization or globalism, that its rise could be exploited for domestic political gain. And I think one of the things that really struck me, I certainly didn't anticipate this, is how quickly the Republican Party reversed course on the China question it didn't take 4 years. I mean, they've done a 180 on this question. I mean, Mick knows this. Back in 2016, to the extent that Republicans were jumping up about national security, it was Russia and Iran that they were concerned about. And now it is pretty much China 24/7. And so if it's Trump, I would expect that we would see more, he would treat the outcome of the election as a vindication of his approach towards China and probably everything else. But that would be one of the big takeaways for him. And if it's Biden, I don't think it will lead to a reset of relations with China. I think that that we will see Biden try to figure out a way, and here I'm getting, I think, directly to your question, of connecting China to what has to happen on the domestic side in the United States, not putting up tariff barriers, but finding a way to use the concerns and the anxieties about China to push forward in the United States. I would look for a Biden to seize on something like the Schumer-Mendez bill that is before the Senate right now, calling for, it's a $350 billion plan. I know in an environment where we're talking about trillions, a trillion here, a trillion there, I mean, sooner or later that adds up to real money. That $350 billion doesn't sound like a lot, but that's a lot of change. And the purpose of that plan? To confront the clear and present threat that China poses to economic prosperity and security. And the point of that is not to put up barriers. That's not what they're calling for. They're calling for the federal government to get into the business of promoting growth in different regions and in different industries of the United States. And so what I would expect is that if we see Biden is an attempt to reimagine the domestic political economy. This is what is problematic right now in the United States, and I would argue is broken, is that its foreign policy, which for so long was connected to the domestic political economy, has been not exactly severed, but it is in disrepair right now. And that is, it's creating a lot of friction internally in the United States. That's what's got to be repaired. And so I think that is going to be the principal focus, and it's going to have implications for where the U.S. invests its time internationally. It is just not going to be doing it across the board. I don't know. I've kind of gone on for a while. I'll leave it.
No, I'll quickly follow up there. I mean, Peter said a lot about the China thing, so we can maybe move it to transatlantic and UK and focus in on that, and maybe even on Russia too, if that's, and hopefully Latin America, about which I know much less, but I'll say something about each of those just to add to what Peter has said. Firstly, on the UK, well, as you all know, and I'm sure Spain knows as well as anybody else, the UK is in very tight and complicated relations at the moment about how to withdraw, not to withdraw. We're beyond that debate. It's no longer a question of with a Brexit. It's about how Brexit is going to happen. We'll have to wait and see. However, the truth of the matter is that whoever becomes the next president of the United States, I think the situation for the UK is not going to be easy in terms of a trade deal. Trump, because he's a trade warrior, and although his mother may have been Scottish or his grandmother may have been Scottish, and he's got golf courses all over Scotland or he's got them. Nonetheless, he's a trade warrior, and he will look after American economic interests worse. I don't think his sentiment really enters into Donald Trump's calculus as a kind of businessman running the United States. So I think there's a lot of hope in the conservative ranks. I know at number 10 inside the bunker at number 10 that they're going to get this trade deal. They're putting a big emphasis at the moment in the UK on the new trade deal with Japan, hoping that could be levered for a trade deal with the United States. But beware, America's a very different kettle of fish. If Biden were to win, as we've already heard, there is a very large Irish-American lobby and a very large Irish-American bloc within, I call it a bloc, but you know what I'm saying, within Congress. Nancy Pelosi has been to the LSE twice over the last few years, hasn't she, Peter? Peter Chad.
He has.
And, you know, Nancy is a formidable person and a formidable within the House and in American politics, has made quite clear to the British government that any playing around with the Good Friday Agreement, any kind of, that's it. You know, and so Nancy Pelosi is a huge player in the House, and trade will always go through Congress first. You know, that's where it's got to go through. So for the UK, without being too parochial about it, Adam, but you did ask the question, I think it's going to be very tough. Whatever the outcome is of the Brexit negotiations, one way or another, and even forgetting the COVID impact. On the transatlantic, I mean, Biden has said it again and again and again and again, that basically transatlantic relations have gone into freefall, or have not been in a good state for the last few years, and he's going to make a huge effort to repair the relations with the EU and indeed with its partners across the Atlantic. I think that could be done relatively easily, to be perfectly honest. I mean, for all of Trump's talk about not liking NATO, the truth of the matter is America's actually invested more in NATO, not less. So, you know, I kind of see it's going to be relatively easy if Biden were to win to repair the transatlantic relationship, because it's actually still in quite a strong state. You know, we want to move away from the headlines to the underlying structural relations, and they're still very strong on economics, on security, intelligence sharing, and many, many others. So that would be low-hanging fruit, would it not, Peter? The big one could easily be Russia itself, you know, because as we know, there's been an ambiguous relationship in Trump and Putin, Trump and Russia. Again, I don't see Biden really changing tack on Russia. I think Russia is still going to be where it stands at the moment, very much regarded as a threat and a challenge to the broader Western alliance. More generally, Biden has talked multilateralism. He's talked international institutions as a way of putting clear blue water between himself and Trump. He said that America is more isolated now than it's been forever, and he wants to repair that isolation, particularly with democratic countries, and that means particularly and especially with the European countries like the UK, like Spain, and with the EU. And I think that will happen. Whether that's going to, however, lead to a fundamental redrawing of all its relations with the rest of the world, I don't know. Because in a way, we get back to structures. It's like the structure of power. You know, you've got to do a lot of stuff in order to undermine American power, as Peter said. You know, America did recover from Vietnam. You know, it did recover from the Iraq War. It's going through a tough time at the moment. So it's still got an enormous amount of structural economic power. And it's still, let's not forget this, just a structural point, it still sits at the heart of the world economic order. It is the dollar, which is still the main currency of international trade. America is still the largest market in the world, along with the European Union. You know, the United States determines what really is going to go on inside the International Monetary Fund and the EU, the World Bank, in alliance with its various allies. So we could talk forever about how much Trump has changed things, but also let's not forget the fundamental continuities of structural economic power and America's situation at the very heart of the world economic order still today.
Thank you.
Adam, I'm wondering if I can kind of just follow up on Mick's very good points there about the UK and especially Europe. So, I mean, first, I agree with Mick. I think the UK is in for a rude awakening. I've been saying this for some time. I think, you know, by opting to take itself out of the EU, it's made itself less useful as an ally to the United States. Before, you know, by being in the EU, it functioned partly as a political counterweight to some obvious players in the EU. And I agree with Mick that the prospects for a US-UK trade deal are not especially bright. They're probably better under Trump than Biden, but either way, Mick is like, you know, dead right here. The important player here is not Donald Trump and it's not Joe Biden. It's Nancy Pelosi. And I would say, in addition to Nancy Pelosi, the Speaker of the House, it's Richie Neal, who is the chairman of the House Ways and Means Committee and who is a prominent Irish American. any messing, as Mick says, with the Good Friday Agreement, I think you can basically kiss this baby goodbye, of a trade agreement. It would require, what I think it would require is a new UK leader. So a fresh start. So Boris would have to leave before that happened. And it's worth just remembering that under the best of circumstances in the US, it's damn hard to get a trade deal through the Congress, and these would not be the best of circumstances. On the EU, I agree with Mick. I mean, I think, but I want to add something to it. I mean, I think we can expect, if he is elected, a lot of very early gestures right out of the box, maybe day one, rejoining the Paris Climate Treaty, better international coordination on COVID. That would come, a lot of talk, maybe a lot of happy talk about multilateralism. I think all of that is true as a way to signal that the United States is back, it's willing to renew and strengthen its ties with longstanding, allies and friends. To me, and I'd be interested in hearing Mick's thoughts on this, to me, the more interesting dimension of this is whether Biden would look for ways to cajole and pressure the Europeans to adopt a common transatlantic stance on China. One of the things Mick said about Russia, I completely agree with. So that I don't see Biden kind of like trying to invest a lot of political capital in improving that relationship. But given that he is going to be constrained domestically, yet have to deal with China, he's going to need some inexpensive ways to do that. It seems to me, rather than like building up military forces in East Asia. And I think that Biden is in a funny way, it will find himself, if he's if he's elected, in a situation somewhat analogous to the one Nixon inherited in the late 60s and early 70s, a kind of America preoccupied by domestic matters, stagnant growth, racial unrest, neo-isolationism, but facing international pressures to check a rival power. And, in this case, a kind of like a rising one, but that has gotten a lot of traction politically in the United States. And, what Nixon did was he forged a tacit alliance with China, which was a fairly inexpensive way to put counter pressure on Moscow. And so the question is whether or not Biden would try to do something similar by trying to get the Europeans to agree to a common position on trade and investment, to get leverage against Beijing. And frankly, I think he could move London. So, and, I'm not sure, where Italy's a complicated story. I mean, the Germans would scream a lot about this, it seems to me. But just to go back to those Pew polls that Mick mentioned, there's a recent one, which is really striking. So the U.S. has lost a lot of altitude. Turns out so is China. Since March, when you look at these polls and it kind of negative views of China, they have spiked across the board in Europe and Germany in particular. It's really gone up. So I don't know that, Biden can channel an inner Kissinger, because this is kind of realpolitik and there's a limit, I think, to how far he could push the Europeans, but he could use human rights as a way to do this. And so I don't know. I pose that actually as a question to my esteemed colleague from the election.
Well, your esteemed colleague, you've actually stolen my best lines there, Peter. Thank you. I actually had that Pew poll in front of me, and it shows decline in faith in President Xi. It says publics have lost confidence in President Xi of China. And the figures for Italy go from 54% last year. Now 75% have no confidence. In Germany, 78% have no confidence. In Sweden, 82% have no confidence. And that may well be something that a Biden administration may be able to tap into to create a common, coherent strategy towards China. At the moment, although there are many European governments who will kind of half go along with Trump, half go along, they won't fully go along with Trump on trade wars, but they will accept that there is a China problem now that has to be addressed. It's not just an easygoing partner and stakeholder. I think we've moved beyond that. I think actually Biden could be much more successful at building that kind of coalition around what I would call a unified Western strategic position towards China, one which I hope also has balance within it as well. You know, it's all very talking about isolating and punishing China or containing China. Well, I think that's absurd.
Right.
You can't contain China. It's out of the box. A balanced strategy with incentives for good behavior at home and abroad and negative incentives, you know, which is what his strategy is all about. That is something that Biden could do. And it's something I think Trump is finding extraordinarily difficult to do because there is so much negativity and suspicion of Trump within Europe. So in that sense, in transatlantic terms, it could also have an impact on a broader Western strategy towards China. That's a very interesting point, Peter. Yeah, it's great. Yeah.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Professor Cox, Professor Trubowitz. We're going to have to leave it there, I'm afraid, but I can only thank you for your terrific inputs and insights into what is a most extraordinary event coming up very soon. And for us, between Madrid and London, to be able to reconnect both the Foundation and the London School of Economics, as we have done many, many times over the last few years. So thank you again for your views. Enormously enriching, I think, to also take a step back from the noise and from the kind of headlines that we see across the world when it comes to the US, and think more structurally, more fundamentally about where it's coming from and where it may be going. So thank you both again for joining us, and we look forward to continuing our discussions at another date, and we look forward to the election itself, and let's see what happens.
Thank you, Adam. It's great to be with you, and Mick, wonderful to be with you again.
As always, Peter, there we go.
Thank you.
No, it's great. Thank you, Peter. Thank you, Adam. And thank you to your audience at the Fundación for hosting this. It's a great, we have a great alumni group down in Spain, I know. And, you know, it's wonderful to cement that. Great work you're doing down there, Adam, as well.
Thank you.
Great to be with all of you. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Bye now.
Bye now.